On previous videos, we've uh, looked at the Eastern religions, the most significant ones. And at this point, we wanted to start to look at the Western grouping of religions. And we're going to look at them consecutively. So we're going to start with Judaism. It seems natural to want to contrast the Eastern religions with Western religions, and there are a lot of interesting contrasts that could be made, and just maybe the conception of God as transcendent or uh, a God of the beyond is one way of thinking about it, and uh, the idea that in Western religions there's only one lifetime for people to get things right, and whereas in most of the Eastern religions, reincarnation seems to be a way of thinking about things, and you get more than one lifetime in order to work things out for yourself. So that's interesting. There's a lot of other distinctions, like where the sacred books come from, whether they come from sages, uh, ancient sages, or whether they come through prophets. You say it's divine revelation. Also, in the West, there tends to be this idea of sin as the explanation for the human situation, whereas in the East, it seems to be more a matter of ignorance. And that affects what one's trying to achieve and how one thinks one can go about achieving that as well. So there's a lot of interesting uh, consequences of those distinctions. It's not our purpose to go into those at the moment. It'd be quite a study, actually. But we just want to, I guess, we'll let the religions speak for themselves, and we're going to start with Judaism. So in this video, we wanted to look at some of the basic features of Judaism, some of its basic practices, some of its basic divisions, identify its sacred books, etc. I have included a couple of images here on this cover slide, and right beneath me is an image of the menorah, which is pretty well known, I think, and which is represents what the celebration of Hanukkah in 8 days, in which an additional candle is lit each day to commemorate what is taken to be a kind of miracle. When there wasn't enough oil to even burn for one day, then the candles burn for 8 days. The other image here is a very interesting one. To me, when I look at it, it's pretty fascinating. And this is a rendering of the temple built by Solomon. So this would be the first temple that the Hebrews had. And you see it's got a lot of fascinating aspects to it. And again, that's also would take a lot of research. I mean, to go into too much in detail, but you get some impression of the grandeur of the first temple, at least. So let's get into it and see what we can learn about Judaism, this first of the Western religions. As I just mentioned, Judaism is the first of the Western monotheistic religions, sometimes referred to as Abrahamic religions.
The other two are Christianity and Islam. If we're looking at them chronologically, we're going to start with Judaism, and then we'll focus on Christianity, and then on Islam. The three of them are grouped together, and for good reason. They have a very almost the same conception of God can be found in each of them. In general, God is viewed as the creator of all things. God's viewed as omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and perfectly good as well. As the creator of everything, God has to be thought of as transcendent, which just means that his being has to be thought of as beyond the created world in order to be the creator. So that's different than a conception of God where God is immanent or part of everything that exists. We could say monotheism, we've encountered it before in the Eastern religions. In particular, we talked in Hinduism, how there was a way of viewing Hinduism as monotheistic. And you could also say that Taoism looks like, in some sense, it's monotheistic. I mean, there's one source of everything in Taoism. Even though you could say these religions are also monotheistic, there's a lot of differences between the Eastern religions and the Western religions. One of the major differences is this. In Western religions, there's the belief that we only have this one life to live, and you only have basically one chance in order to get things right, and then our souls may exist in the afterlife, but will be forever living out the consequences of what we do in this life. And as we know in Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth, there's this idea of reincarnation, so you have more opportunities to get yourself together to get things right. That's a pretty major difference, and it has some consequences on how we might look at the life that we do have to live. The other big difference, I think, is that in Western religions, there's a belief that the source of the religion comes from God, and that the holy books or the sacred scriptures that we have are actually divinely inspired, or that the words of God are revealed through the prophets, or we say God speaks through the prophets and they write down the messages that he has for us as human beings. This is pretty different from religions, some other religions in the East, where it looks like, at least the idea is that the teachings come from other human beings, maybe more accomplished, more realized, human sages, wise men, and so forth in the past. In Judaism, God is referred to as Yahweh. And indeed, even in the present age, you find that Jews are reluctant to write the word God. There's a feeling that you can't know enough about God to even say his name or write his name. So if they were going to write the word God, they might write God dash G dash D, and to try and avoid, the presumption, as though you could say his name and understand something about God as a result. The second point here is that this is a religion, Judaism, which is characterized by a search for meaning. Houston Smith emphasizes this in his chapter on Judaism in our textbook. Almost every section, every aspect that he writes about in relationship to this religion is related to how we as human beings could find meaning in it in Judaism. In particular, you could say the Hebrews found meaning for their own existence through their relationship with God. This is the central feature of Judaism. The Torah, the sacred text, is actually a historical or the historical account of this relationship between God and the Hebrews. And in the Torah, it only goes up to a certain point historically, but you have to assume the history is still moving forward. So in the Torah, and you have an emphasis on history, and it's kind of linear history, straight line, and it's also kind of progressive conception of history. So there's a timeline, and the underlying belief is that it's moving in a certain direction. It has a beginning, and it's moving towards an end. In the Torah, we get the story that God appears or announces himself to the Hebrews, to the patriarch Abraham initially, and they entered into a covenant or a kind of an agreement with, say, obligations on both sides. So God asked Abraham and his people to worship God, have a respectful relationship with God, and in return, God would see that they prospered. And then you could say that the story in the Torah is the story of how that relationship develops as time goes forward. And you say occasionally God is going to be present in the story or is going to enter into the story in order to make sure something happens the way that he wants. The first assignment that I asked you to accomplish for this subject was to comment on some of the highlights of the story, some of the major characters and events and what role they played in the development of the history of the Jews and their relationship with God. Another way in which human existence is structured is with instruction from God in terms of morality. So I think almost everyone is familiar with the story of how Moses received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. And these were presented as, or we could say that these are rules that enable us to live together in peace and harmony. A lot of the rules have that aim, but also there's rules relating to how we should be relating to God. Say the first four all have to do with how we should think and act in relationship to God, and then the rest of them have more to say about how we should be relating to one another. So it's a pretty simple set of rules, not exactly unique to Judaism. There is an addendum to this. I mean, you say in Judaism, especially in Rabbinic Judaism, which has an early beginning, but it's a beginning, I think, beyond the story of the Torah. The Jews have identified an additional 613 laws that observant Jews are expected to be obedient to. A lot of these have to do with the kinds of foods that you can eat. So you can say Jews who try to keep kosher, and kosher means there are certain animals that it's okay that you eat them, some not. And Jews try to avoid eating pork, for instance. And there's some combinations of foods that you can't put together. You can eat dairy and you can eat meat, but you can't eat them combined with each other. And there's a lot of rules also about religious observances, how to celebrate holidays and other rituals. And it's a very rigorous and demanding commitment that people undertake when they decide that they want to be observant, sort of in the stricter sense of the word. Another aspect of this emphasis on morality that Judaism is known for is that we get a kind of ethical monotheism that emphasizes justice and, in particular, social justice. You say Judaism has long emphasized this and standing up for social justice, and I think, arguably, I suppose, but and others have also commented on this more so than in Christianity. You say in Christianity there frequently appears to be a kind of otherworldly emphasis or quality, where the spiritual world is emphasized more. In Judaism, the focus was almost always on this world and the affairs in this world. This particular emphasis on justice can be found uh, in what Houston Smith calls the prophetic tradition. I'll just say in general, before we comment on that tradition, that a prophet is someone who speaks for another. In the religious context, someone who speaks for God, or someone whom God speaks through. We could say in the Torah, Moses is the most outstanding example of this kind of prophet, and uh, and also the most important of all the Jewish prophets. And it was Moses, which we all know. I mean, was the one who led the Hebrews out of captivity in Egypt, and in doing so, he brought them together as a people, really for the first time, and led them to an independent existence. So Moses, aside from that, Moses also is thought to, besides receiving the Ten Commandments, also received the five books that are contained within the Torah, and that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. That those were given to him on the mountain as well. Smith talks about this prophetic tradition and uh, and as a kind of tradition that developed, and this was something I wasn't so familiar with before I read what Houston Smith had to say about it. But his claim is that the first appearance of the prophets were that they were groups of people who came together on a regular basis and engaged in a number of activities of a religious nature. But some of these activities involved music and dancing, and that uh, it seemed as though there was the possibility of going into trance-like states, or we say fever pitches of possession, or kind of ecstatic type experiences. You could say so people had special experiences as a result of those activities or practices. Initially, there wasn't anything written down as a result of these experiences, nor was it God speaking, giving messages, specific messages to people, but it was believed that there was a kind of connection with the divine that was accomplished in these ways. The second stage of this development he calls individual pre-writing prophets. And we say he names Elijah, Elisha, Nathan. And these are still individuals connected with prophetic groups, but not so dependent on them anymore, and that they're still members of these groups, but kind of not. They can exist separately from them. And these prophets did speak in the name of God, or you could say again that God spoke through them. And even a king could be denounced for some injustice to his face in the name of God. So here the ethical begins in this tradition. And these prophets spoke in the name of justice with the authority of God whenever they felt that some particular leader was doing being unjust. He could be criticized for it. The final stage were the writing prophets Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, Isaiah. In this stage, we get social criticism, not just individuals who are criticized. The whole nation could be called to task, again, in the name of God. And it could be a warning given in this case with the kind of that the people better shape up or else there'll be some price to pay. One particular aspect of Judaism that carries on into Christianity is this idea of messianism, the idea of a Messiah. For the Hebrews, the golden age that they achieved with during the reign of the three kings, King Saul, King David, and King Solomon, was just that. It was a kind of a golden age, but it was pretty short-lived. After the death of King Solomon, Israel became divided in, I think it was between Israel in the north and Judea in the south. And before too much time went by, both of those halves of the kingdom were conquered by the Babylonians. And the temple that King Solomon built was destroyed. And a lot of the people were taken back as prisoners to Babylon. And that's a period referred to as the Babylonian captivity. So, and from that time forward, the Hebrews, even though they returned to their homeland after the Babylonian captivity, they always lived in territories that were controlled by other peoples. I mean, first, Alexander the Great sort of conquered the entire area, and you had a strong Hellenistic influence that included Palestine, Judea, whatever. However, they referred to the territory that the Hebrews lived in at that time. And then after the Greeks and the Romans sort of took over the territory. So the Jews are always kind of in an occupied territory. And although they were free to practice their religion the way that they wanted, they had to pay taxes to the governing forces and so forth, and there was very limited freedoms that they had. So one of the hopes that developed amongst the people was that a leader would come, a new king that would bring the people together so that they could achieve their independence from the occupation forces and liberate the people again and initiate a new age and a return to some of their past glory. So that clearly never happened, but the hope was still that there would be a Messiah or a chosen one who would achieve that for them. The idea of the Messiah, was then taken up in Christianity, and the belief was that Jesus was the Messiah, although not the kind of Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for. Jesus was more of a spiritual Messiah, not a worldly king, but more of a spiritual king. And so some of the Jews may have embraced Jesus initially, but were disappointed that it didn't, that Jesus wasn't a worldly leader that they hoped for. Another interesting feature of Judaism is what Houston Smith refers to as the hallowing of life. And he points out this characterization, which I hadn't heard before, but is interesting. That he refers to Judaism as an orthopraxis, and that the emphasis in Judaism was always doing things a certain way, standard practice, doing things a certain way. And that's different than, I think you could say, Christianity is more of an orthodoxy, a set of beliefs that people have, a creed. So in Judaism, the emphasis was always on ceremonies and rituals and doing things in certain ways, and that was what the religion consisted of. After they were expelled from the Middle East after the destruction of the Second Temple, this what we call the diaspora, the spreading of the peoples throughout the world. There was the Jews didn't have the access to the temple that which was the central focus of their religion while they were still in Judea. The focus of their religion had to change, and it became more focused on activities that occurred within your own home. So you could make a religious service out of just a meal, eating and drinking. So there were, say, you could have a Seder, which became a tradition. So the ordinary activities of life could be sanctified, could be made holy, could be ritualized. And in a way, the whole of life could be sanctified in this way. And in a lot of ways, the Jews tried to accomplish that. This brings a lot of religion into how you do things on a day-to-day basis. But you could see that the object or the aim of these activities was to try to see God in everything, to be reminded of God, to remember your relationship with God, even in the most mundane activities. I don't know if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof. There's this opening song that Tevi, the main character, sings, and at a certain point, he talks about all the things that the people do, all the traditions they have, and he sort of asked himself, he said, why do we do these things? And he said, I don't know, but because we have these traditions, it enables each of us to know who we are and what God expects of us. So that was, you know who you are because of the things that you do. And you also, these traditions help you understand what your relationship with God is supposed to be. So there's a kind of clarity can come into your existence as a result of following the traditions. One of the things that's peculiar about Judaism is the idea that the Jews were a chosen people. So because God introduced himself to Abraham, and the initial relationship between God was between God and the Hebrews. So it's puzzling if you're not part of that group, as to think why God, if he's a God for all people or a universal God, why would he choose a particular people to be related to in a special way? So it didn't mean, being the chosen people didn't mean that the Jews had a better time of it than other people did, and actually they suffered a great deal. Even more was demanded of them. And in general, the life of their people was difficult. Still, this claim of being the chosen people opens up Judaism for some criticism. It ultimately Judaism can be thought of as an ethnic religion, the religion of just a particular people. And as such, it wouldn't have much significance for other peoples. So it couldn't have much universal appeal if that's what Judaism was all about. Houston Smith, I think we've already commented on this in our section on Hinduism, but Smith argues that Hinduism was similar in this regard, and that an ethnic religion, and also therefore without much universal appeal. But in both cases, new religions emerged out of these older religions, and more universal religions emerged out of them. So in the case of Judaism, Christianity appeared. In the case of Hinduism, Buddhism appeared. Smith argues that there was too much truth in both of the foundations to be combined to just a single people. In the contemporary world, we have to make some comment of the nation of Israel, and just point out that this nation of Israel was reestablished in 1948 at the end of World War II. There were arguments in favor of giving the Jews a homeland again. And the Jews had been much persecuted in other parts of the world where they lived. They kind of needed a safe sanctuary. And I'm sure there were arguments against the idea, but the reality is now that the Jews have a homeland once again. And although that fact has yet to be accepted by a number of Israel's neighbors, and as a result, peace with its neighbors had not yet been achieved. And it certainly seems as though that conflict will be ongoing for a good bit of time to come, to say the least. It's been going on for a really long time. And it doesn't seem to be any easy solution in sight for it. Just a couple of more details about Judaism. Already mentioned that the Torah is the central focus, the primary religious text for Judaism. Torah contains what are called the books of Moses. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, 5 books. After the Torah, there is the Tanakh, the Hebrew, what could be called the Hebrew Bible, and the Tanakh is a compilation of texts that includes the Torah and also most of the books that make up the Christian Old Testament, or maybe all of the books that are in the Christian Old Testament. So you have the first 5 books, the Torah, which are also in the Old Testament, books of the prophets, other writings such as Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, etc. In addition to those two, if you went into a synagogue, the Torah is always kept in the form of a scroll, usually a sacred scroll, which is kept in the Holy of Holies and is only brought out during religious services to be read. The Tanakh, however, if you went into a synagogue, you'd find copies of the Tanakh in the pews where people sit and so forth. Beyond that, there's the Talmud, which is a record of rabbinic Judaism. So, that was one of the questions I asked you to try and figure out, what is rabbinic Judaism? When did it when was it initiated? And that is kind of rabbinic Judaism includes like interpretations of the Torah. And so when we say the 613 laws that Jews are supposed to be observant to come from readings of the Torah, study of the Torah. So there was the rabbinic commentaries on the Torah. That would be the Talmud. And there was also an oral Torah, or oral teaching that was passed on. And some of those laws are related to the oral teaching as well. So both the oral and the written uh, Talmud interpretations are uh, included in rabbinic Judaism. Just in general, Judaism is kind of open-ended in this regard. I mean, you say it's never been the case, or as far as I can tell, never will be the case, that the interpreting will stop. So it's an ongoing interpretation. So you have the basic text, and there's always an attempt to interpret those texts in light of present events and times and so forth. So there's a rich intellectual tradition, sort of is part of Jewish traditions. A lot of reading, a lot of interpreting, and a kind of open-ended sense to it all. Finally, there's the groups within, or the divisions within Judaism, and it's not just one interpretation, clearly, but there's a lot of different approaches to being Jewish. And even in a way, being Jewish is a cultural determination, and it can also be a religious determination, but you can be Jewish without being religious. And if you're a religious Jew, you could be Orthodox, conservative, Reconstructionist, or Reform. And like starting with the Orthodox, that's the most strict form of living, where you're trying to be obedient to all these rules. Conservative is also pretty strict in terms of keeping kosher and sort of observing all the laws that come with rabbinic Judaism. I think Reconstructionist and Reform is a little freer. People can kind of pick and choose what they want to pay attention to. So it's the Reconstructionist and Reform are both attempts to update the religious practices from what they were in the ancient world. So there's a wide range of practices and observance within Judaism.